No matter where you are in the world, get ready to be hooked. Some mountain man found a young giant widow hanging on a tree with a sign, "White men don't forgive." A story so powerful it will leave you speechless. What happens next isn't just surprising, it's unforgettable. So hit that like button, subscribe for more, and share this with someone who loves a good story. From the US to the UK, from Asia to Africa, this one's for you. Let's dive in! The sun was still climbing above the rolling hills when Ezekiel Boone came down from the ridge and into the valley. The air was dry, the kind of sharp morning wind that carried the dust of the trail into every wrinkle of a man's face. His horse was weary, his rifle slung across his shoulder, and the weight of solitude pressed heavy on him. Ezekiel was a mountain man by every definition, lonely hard, and shaped by years of living where no laws reached. He trapped, he hunted, he wandered. He had no family left, and the mountains had become his home. Yet, despite all that, nothing in his long, rough life had prepared him for what he saw when he reached the settlement. The town was small, little more than a handful of weather-beaten cabins, a trading post, and a saloon. Yet it was buzzing that morning with a strange tension. Men stood in small knots, whispering with hardened faces, and women peered from their porches with wide eyes. Children were pulled inside as if the very air carried something dangerous. Ezekiel, curious, guided his mule toward the sound of murmurs until he reached the heart of the gathering. There, before him, a sight struck him cold. On a rough, hewn scaffold, lashed to heavy wooden beams, stood a woman. Her wrists were bound high above her head, thick ropes cutting into her flesh, but she was no fragile victim. She was a giant of a woman, her muscles coiled like iron beneath bronzed skin, her shoulders wide, her arms thick with power that looked capable of breaking free at any moment. Her garments were little more than torn buckskin, yet her presence was anything but broken. Her hair was black and wild, hanging over her face, but her eyes, sharp, unflinching, stared out at the crowd with a fire that no rope could quench. Above her, nailed crudely to the beam, hung a wooden sign. In thick black paint, the words stood stark, emendurnt, far giv. The word white had been painted over in red, smeared unevenly but with hateful intent. The sign was meant as a warning, a proclamation that whatever crime this woman had been accused of, mercy was not on the table. Ezekiel slowed, his eyes narrowing beneath his fur cap. He had seen hangings before. He had seen men stretched from trees as warnings. But there was something about this woman that struck deeper. She was not a murderer who shrank under the weight of her sins, nor a thief begging for reprieve. She stood tall, unbent, like a storm caged in wood and rope. A sheriff in a broad hat leaned lazily against a post nearby, his rifle resting in his arms. His beard was streaked with grey, his eyes cold, and his voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "This here," he said, "is what happens when a woman thinks she can rise against what God himself put in place. She thought herself above our laws, above our land, above our men. Well, she's wrong. She'll hang until the buzzards tire of her." The crowd gave a low murmur of agreement, though not all voices were steady. Some men nodded grimly, but others looked away. A few women clutched their aprons, torn between fear and pity. Children were nowhere in sight, pulled away so as not to see what the adults called justice. Ezekiel said nothing. He simply watched, his grip tightening slightly on his rifle strap. He was not a man quick to anger, nor one eager to meddle in the affairs of towns. But he had lived too long on the edge of life not to recognize the weight of injustice when it stared him in the face. The woman's name reached his ears in whispers. Adelina Greywolf. She was called a widow, her husband a man of the valley who had fought to keep his land from the hands of settlers hungry to expand. When rifles had been raised against him, when his blood had stained the soil, Adelina had risen like a storm. She had fought them with her bare hands, defying men who thought themselves unbreakable. Rumors painted her as both demon and legend. Some said she had split rifles apart with nothing but her strength. Others swore she had thrown men like rag dolls until they fled in terror. Whether the stories were true or not, Ezekiel could see one truth in her eyes: she was not broken, and she was not sorry. Adelina's gaze swept the crowd, landing briefly on him. For a moment, Ezekiel felt something pass between them. Not recognition, not plea, but an understanding. She knew she was marked for death, and yet she stood as though death itself had no claim on her spirit. The sheriff barked an order, and 2 deputies stepped forward to check the ropes. The chair beneath her was shifted, and though it was not yet time to hang her, the preparation was clear. They wanted her suffering displayed. They wanted her humiliation to be remembered. That night, as the settlement quieted and the crowd dispersed, Ezekiel sat by a fire at the edge of town, his mind restless. The widow's face hovered in his thoughts, her eyes lit with fire even as her body was chained. He thought of the sign above her, its cruel words, its declaration of unforgiving hate. He had wandered through lands claimed by no man, through mountains where only silence reigned, and he had seen the cruelty men carried with them when they carved settlements into the wild. Yet something about this woman's plight pressed against him like a weight. Ezekiel knew what it meant to be alone, to have the world turned against you. He knew what it was to lose everything and to walk on anyway, carrying scars no one else would see. And now, here she was, carrying not just her own grief, but the wrath of men who feared her strength. The next morning, the townsfolk gathered again, the scaffold looming as the center of attention. Ezekiel stood at the back, silent, blending into the edges. The sheriff spoke again, his words cutting through the crowd like a whip. This woman thought herself a law unto herself. She thought she could take blood for blood. Well, we have laws here. White men don't forgive, and she will pay for the crimes she committed. Adelina, bound but unyielding, raised her chin. Her voice carried across the square, deep and unwavering. You call it law, she said. But it is only theft and fear dressed in your words. You killed my husband for his land. You tried to kill me for standing against you. And now you hang me not for justice, but because you cannot bear the sight of a woman who will not kneel. A hush fell over the crowd. The sheriff's face twisted, but her words had pierced the silence. Some men muttered angrily, others looked away, ashamed. Ezekiel felt the words settle in his chest like stones. He had no love for towns or their rules, but her defiance, her refusal to break, stirred something deep within him. That day passed with tension. They did not hang her yet. They wanted the fear to grow, the lesson to sink in. They left her tied to the beam, arms stretched, body displayed, the sign above her proclaiming her guilt to anyone who passed. She did not cry. She did not beg. She simply stood unbroken, her presence more commanding than any law the sheriff claimed to hold. Ezekiel found himself watching her long into the evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched. The settlement quieted, yet her figure remained, a silhouette against the dying light. He thought of the wilderness calling him back, of his mule waiting, of the freedom he had always chosen. Yet he could not turn away. Something held him there, some pull stronger than his own instinct for survival. In that silence, he knew. Adelina Greywolf was no ordinary prisoner, and her story was not finished. Whether he chose it or not, he was already a part of it. The storm came in hard from the west, the kind that swept across plains with a fury that rattled shutters and sent livestock crying into the night. The townsfolk bolted their doors, but even the thickest wood could not hide the groaning wind or the hammering rain. Thunder rolled like cannon fire, and lightning split the sky into jagged pieces. It was the kind of storm that made men whisper of judgment, of nature rising against them. But for Ezekiel Boone, it was something else. It was cover. He moved like a shadow through the mud-slick streets, his coat soaked, his beard dripping. His rifle was slung across his back, though not for killing. Tonight he carried steel for freedom, not for blood. He had made his decision. The image of Adelina Greywolf bound to the scaffold had haunted him too long. He could no longer stand aside while cruelty paraded as law. He was not a man of speeches, not a man of causes, but something about her had ignited a fire he thought long dead. He had lost his own kin to the greed of men, and now he saw her bearing the same burden. The scaffold loomed ahead, its beams black against the flickering storm. She was still there, tied high, her arms stretched, her body refusing to bend. Rain drenched her hair, streaming down the ridges of her powerful frame, but her head was lifted, her eyes open. She had not surrendered to exhaustion, though the ropes had cut her raw. She did not flinch when lightning lit the night, nor when thunder shook the ground beneath her. She stood like a statue carved of defiance, unyielding even in the face of the storm. Ezekiel approached, boots squelching in the mud, his knife already drawn. She turned her head when she heard him, and in her gaze was no fear, no surprise. Instead, there was recognition, as though she had expected this moment, as though she had known the mountain man would return. "You came," she said, her voice steady, though low enough to be lost in the storm for anyone but him. He stepped close, working the blade against the soaked rope. "Couldn't walk away." "Most men do," she replied. The rope gave way with a snap, and her arms fell heavy at her sides, blood rushing back into her limbs. She staggered, her body shaking from the strain, but she caught herself, standing tall even as pain coursed through her veins. Ezekiel cut the bonds at her ankles, then steadied her when she nearly collapsed. Her hand, when it gripped his arm, was like iron, callosed, strong, a testament to a life of survival. "They'll kill you for this," she said. "Maybe," Ezekiel answered, his voice grim. "But they'll kill you for sure if I don't." Together, they slipped into the night, moving with the storm as their cloak. The town was quiet, shutters rattling, dogs barking nervously. No one saw them vanish into the darkness. No one heard the crunch of boots swallowed by mud and rain. By the time the storm began to ease, they were far beyond the settlement, hidden in the folds of the valley where trees bent low and streams roared with swollen water. Ezekiel built a small fire beneath a cluster of rocks, careful to keep it low. Adelina sat across from him, her wrists raw and bleeding, but her eyes alive with the fire of the free. For a long while, they said nothing, the crackle of flame and the hiss of rain filling the silence. Finally, she spoke. "They'll come for you now," she said. "You cut their pride along with those ropes. They'll come for both of us." Ezekiel replied. He poked the fire with a stick, his eyes never leaving her. "But they won't find it easy." Adelina studied him, her face hard but thoughtful. "You don't strike me as a man who picks battles for others." "I don't," he admitted. "But I've seen enough to know when a thing's wrong. What they did to you, it weren't justice. It was hate dressed up like law. And I've buried enough of my own to know I can't watch another die the same way." Her gaze softened, just slightly. "Then we are alike." For days they moved together through the wilderness, hunted by men who carried rifles and vengeance in their hearts. Word spread quickly. Ezekiel Boone, the mountain man, had betrayed the settlers by freeing the widow they meant to kill. Posters were tacked to posts, names spat like curses. The sheriff swore he would drag them back, dead or alive, to hang them both as an example. But the wilderness was Ezekiel's home, and Adelina was no ordinary woman. She carried her strength like a weapon, hauling fallen logs to build barriers, lifting stones to clear their path. When they hunted for food, she moved with a predator's silence, her hands steady as she skinned game with a precision that came from years of survival. Ezekiel found himself watching her not just with respect, but with awe. He had never seen such a force of will in anyone. At night, around the fire, they spoke little, but what was said carried weight. She told him of her husband, a man named Thomas Greywolf, who had been shot down when he refused to surrender his land to the sheriff's men. She had buried him with her own hands, and when they came for her, she had fought with everything she had. She had no regrets, no apologies. Her voice carried the grief of loss, but it also carried the iron of conviction. Ezekiel listened, and in her story, he saw shadows of his own. His wife and child had been taken by fever years ago, buried beneath lonely stones in the mountains. He had walked ever since, carrying his sorrow into the wilderness, letting solitude consume him. He had thought himself hollow, beyond purpose. But in Adelina, he felt the stirrings of something he thought long gone, the pull of standing for more than just survival. Their bond grew not through words, but through shared hardship. When hunters came close, they fought together, rifles cracking in the night, knives flashing in the dark. When hunger pressed, they tracked game side by side, silent partners in the art of survival. And when silence settled, they shared it as though it were a language of its own, a space where grief and strength mingled without the need for speech. The sheriff and his men did not relent. They pressed harder, sending riders into the mountains, spreading fear among the towns. But the harder they hunted, the more the legend grew. Whispers spread of the giant widow who could not be broken, and the mountain man who defied his own kind to stand with her. Some settlers cursed their names, but others, especially those who had felt the cruelty of the sheriff's law, began to tell their story with respect, even with admiration. Weeks passed, and the chase became a war of endurance. Ezekiel and Adalina moved deeper into the wild, carving a path where few dared to follow. Their nights were restless, their days hard, but each step forged them closer together. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon in shades of red and gold, Adalina stood at the edge of a ridge, her silhouette vast against the sky. Ezekiel watched her, the firelight flickering across his face. She turned, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time, her voice held something softer than steel. "You gave me back more than freedom," she said. "You gave me back the fight. Alone, I could only stand to die. But with you, I can stand to live." Ezekiel said nothing, but he rose, standing beside her. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and in that moment, they were not fugitives. They were not outlaws. They were something greater. Two souls bound by defiance, unbroken by the world's cruelty. The sheriff would not forgive, and neither would the men who followed him. But forgiveness was never what they sought. What they carried now was something fiercer, survival truth, and the kind of strength that no gallows could ever hang. And so, the legend lived. Not of a widow broken beneath a sign of hate, but of a woman who could not be bent, and of the mountain man who chose to stand beside her when no one else would. Together they vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind whispers that grew louder with each retelling. Some called them criminals, others heroes. But for those who understood, they were a reminder of what it meant to fight when the world demanded you kneel. Their story was not one of forgiveness. It was one of fire, storm, and an unyielding will that no rope could bind.